defined understanding about treatment of refugees from the Ukraine brought up some not attractive feelings and behaviors. A couple of news articles caught my attention, but the comments enlightened me. This is Addi Banks, and this is my report. Why do these things happen? We often ask when our lives are disrupted. There are always reasons why. We may not know or understand them, but they are basic shifts in our normal. And we do not like negative shifts. The war in the Ukraine, like war all over the world, creates predictable behaviors. One is to flee to safety. Refugee is the kind label assigned to those who flee. But there are some other labels that are not so kind, like runners. This article, Striking Difference in How European Refugees Are Seen, March 18, 2022, Yahoo News, Marquise Francis reports that more than 3 million Ukrainians have fled the only place they've ever called home when Russia invaded their country on February 24th, with most seeking refuge in neighboring European nations like Poland, Romania, and Moldova. Almost all these countries have accepted fleeing Ukrainians with welcome arms. The reception of Ukrainian refugees by European countries has been vastly different from previous refugee crises where European countries were largely resistant to being a safe haven for those escaping persecution, including the ongoing Syrian refugee crisis, where since 2015, more than 1 million Syrians have sought refuge in Europe with little to no support. It's a striking difference, Lamas Abdelati, a professor of political science at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, says. Some experts believe that proximity is the most obvious reason for the disparity, as Ukraine shares a border with 7 other European countries, while others have suggested cultural factors, commonality in race and religion, play the biggest part, they write. In a Twitter thread earlier this month, Abdelati, author of Discrimination and Delegation, explaining state responses to refugees, argues that the difference in treatment boils down to identity and foreign policy. She writes, Ukrainians are seen as white, Christian, Syrians, Afghans, and others are not perceived this way. People sympathize with refugees who they think share their race, religion, etc. But identity is not the whole story. There is a foreign policy dimension to it too, she added. It matters that Ukrainians are fleeing a Russian invasion. Welcoming them is another way for European countries to condemn Putin and to powerfully signal which side of the conflict they are on. However, not all refugees fleeing Ukraine have had the same experience. African and Indian men and women, many of whom went to the Ukraine to further their education, have regularly reported being denied space on trains or buses, or face ridicule at the border. They have complained of a somewhat hostile reception from Ukrainian authorities and officials from other European countries that have, by and large, taken in scores of Ukrainians. This disparity in treatment for many illustrates hypocritical attitudes they say have always been present across Europe. Quote, there was a gap in the access Black people and brown people were getting, writes Patricia Daly, one of the 3 women who founded Black Women for Black Lives as a way to help Black people escape Ukraine. She told NBC News, there was no one offering their homes to Black people, no one offering to pick up the Black individuals. There was a tremendous amount of people offering help and support, but I felt that it was limited to Ukrainian nationals alone. And we know what that means. It's excluding a group of people. There was a need to support Black people because they weren't getting the support or access. There was a gap, and we bridged it, she said of her organization. I may report later on the specifics of the disparity between Africans, Indians, and Ukrainians. But for this report, I want to explore the honest feelings of commenters. They wrote on behaviors and actions from their point of view. Settle back. They are extensive. P wrote, there is a big difference. Ukrainians are culturally the same as Western Europe, same religion, Christian, and they are escaping a bully in Putin. I am in Berlin, and I see the difference between the Ukrainians coming in and those from the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Africa. They are cleaner, do not throw trash on the sidewalks and walk off. They know what the trash cans are for. They live cleaner too. So yes, there is a difference on how Ukrainians are being welcomed. Plus, they are not here just for the free handouts. Many have already gone to work, not going on social services. Western Europe sees them as brothers and sisters. D. Striking difference in how women and children refugees are received versus how men aged 18 to 60 are seen. G. Did you ever notice that 85% of the refugees fleeing to Europe before this war were young men? I wonder how their families could possibly survive without them in the terrible conditions they said they fled from. Women and children trying to escape a war is one thing. Young men trying to escape poverty is different. We accept the first group with open arms. The other ones are not wanted. Stay in your country and solve your own problems like the brave men of the Ukraine do. M. There's a big difference in accepting people, mostly women and children. They have a homeland a few hundred kilometers away. They clearly have homes and lives that they want to return to. It is a temporary measure for most, and even if it takes a while, eventually they will return home, as opposed to people entering in illegally, high percentage male, with absolutely no obvious intention of leaving and taking advantage of public policies without any meaningful contribution. At least in the short to midterm. These situations are as far opposite as they can be. The only reason to compare them would be to beg the question you already have in your mind. B, some of these fleeing Iraq, Iran, Syria, etc., especially adult men, were actually terrorists. Some went to France, UK, Germany, and the US and did terrorist acts. Ukrainian people are victims of Russian oppression and trying to steal their country. So it is a big difference and not fair to Ukrainians to make the comparison in the article. The commenter I wrote, I have to disagree with the author of this article. People coming from Ukraine are women and children, most of very young children. These women with children escaped from the constant brutal bombardment of Ukraine's residential areas by the foreign army. These women left their men, teenage sons behind to fight for their country, their freedom against the foreign evil power that mercilessly kills anyone and everyone for illegitimate reasons. These Ukrainians don't want to reside anywhere else permanently but their own country. They're dreaming of coming back home. The author advocates for people from countries with internal problems of power, corruption, etc. So instead of fighting for the democratic society in their birth country, they, primarily young men, immigrated to democratic countries, expecting financial support and legal resident status to stay permanently. Democracy is not free. Ukrainian people earned it with their blood without help from the West in 2013 and 2014. And now they are fighting and dying again to prevent their country from falling under tyranny. F, Ukraine is part of Europe. Europeans are embracing their own. Did Africa and Middle Eastern countries do the same for their refugees? T, let me tell you another difference. The Ukrainians are totally refugees. Almost 100% of them are women and children fleeing a war zone, while they're men staying back to fight for the homeland. The Asians and Africans are almost 100% men, age 15 to 25. Most of them are not fleeing a war, so they are not refugees. And those that do should stay and fight next to their women and children. Kurdish women come to mind that did not flee, but stayed and are still fighting. So you see what I'm saying, my friends. M, is it really a double standard, or is it a failure of Nigerian and other African governments to warn their citizens that European and US governments were advising their citizens to leave Ukraine before the war started? Please don't turn it into a racism issue. People were caught off guard by war, all people. Everyone wants to live, whether you are a Ukrainian or a Nigerian. My mom is a refugee in Poland. When she was crossing the border, there were mostly women and children and African men who were physically pushing other people away. Perhaps that is why they were given their own line at the border, and not because Ukrainians are all racist. M, from Ukraine are mostly women and children, not able-bodied men who should be fighting for their country and rebuilding their homelands. Plus, Ukrainians work and don't come for free social welfare. They assimilate easily. Middle Eastern people want locals to adapt to their ways, not vice versa. They stay in ghettos as seen in Sweden and elsewhere. The better question is why don't other Middle Eastern and African countries help their own neighbors? H, can we get a number of refugees that are accepted by Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain? F, anyone who thinks Europeans are racist because the Ukrainian refugees are being taken in by other European countries with open arms, while refugees from other continents don't get the same welcome, is being simplistic minded. I think the reasons are a lot more complicated. First of all, unlike the greatest majority of people coming from Africa and the Middle East to Europe, the Ukrainians share similar culture and similar religion. In addition, the majority of Ukrainians are educated people who just a few weeks ago had jobs, and for the most part will assimilate and adapt very quickly in another European country, instead of becoming an economic burden in the host country. While many of the immigrants coming from Africa and the Middle East are economic migrants who could not eke out a living in their own countries, and many have had little education in their own country. The other reason is that many people in Europe still have families who suffered the terror of war during World War II. And as a result, they totally identify and empathize with the suffering the Ukrainians are going through, especially since almost all the refugees are vulnerable children and women and elderly people. P. I think it is a matter of what you see. Ukraine, we see mostly women and children who aren't pushing and shoving others to get the seat. Middle Eastern, African refugees, I saw mostly young men pushing away children to get a seat before them. I think most women and children were already in refugee camps and other countries by this time. As far as the Ukrainian situation, I saw about 6 grown men hooping and hollering around one security man. These men are confused. They felt they were told to go to another line because they were Black or African. It is because they are not refugees. They are foreign students whose countries did not provide an exit plan to help them. All students and non-Ukrainians went to a different line if they were stuck in the country once Russia invaded. Most foreign students in the Ukraine came from Africa and India. Finally, D. Why should anyone be surprised that a region is more receptive to refugees that share many, if not most, of the same customs and culture? There you have it. Not race or ethnicity. Not that alone, but principles. Every nation, every ethnic group have created a reputation based on their values and behaviors as perceived and judged by others around the world. We do this, observing the family our children want to marry into, the friends they hang out with, and the people we hire. Take your own test. Listed here are values and behaviors that give reputation to some nations. You assign them. Also, what is the dominant race or ethnicity there?